A millionaire ignored a boy who asked him for food in the street. Years later, the boy returned as a doctor, and what he told the millionaire made him cry. The twilight descended over the city, bathing the skyscrapers in a mix of orange lights and long shadows. The metropolis was a mosaic of contrasts. The main avenues were illuminated by gleaming storefronts displaying the latest in technology and fashion, while nearby alleys were filled with the sound of quick steps and the rustling of crumpled bags. In these corners, darkness and poverty formed an invisible alliance, a world that coexisted with splendor, ignored by those who never looked deeper. Kevin Miller walked with the proud posture and confidence that his millions in the bank and years of unshakable success provided. His suits, always tailored and perfectly fitted, projected unquestionable power. However, behind his grey eyes and clenched jaw, there was an emptiness he didn't dare explore. His days had become a mechanical routine of meetings, endless calls, and dinners with partners as impatient as himself. And although his mansion on the outskirts of the city gleamed under the sun, surrounded by gardens competing with perfection, Kevin never stopped to admire them. The sound of a phone vibrating in his pocket briefly interrupted his thoughts. Marcos, his assistant, was reminding him once again of the meeting with the investors. Marcos, always diligent, moved through Kevin's life like a shadow, absorbing orders with robotic efficiency, hiding his own thoughts and ambitions under a veil of silence. Miles away, the scene was completely different. In a dilapidated old building, Matthew, a 10-year-old boy, huddled next to his younger sister, Lily. The cracked walls seemed to whisper tales of better times, and the wind slipped through the broken windows, bringing a cold that made Lily's small shoulders shiver. The pale-faced girl, with huge eyes, coughed frequently, alarming Matthew, who held her tightly, as though the warmth of his body could protect her from the world. "I can't fail today, Lily," Matthew whispered, his voice barely audible in the dim light. In his mind, the image of the doctors he had seen in old magazines rose like a promise. One day, he would be one of them, and he would save his sister and other children who, like her, struggled to breathe each night. Down the hallway, a door creaked, and Doña Rosa, the elderly neighbor who cared for Matthew and Lily as though they were her own family, appeared. With slow steps and trembling hands, she handed them a worn blanket. Her eyes, full of wrinkles and memories, looked at the children with tenderness and worry. She knew Matthew would soon go out looking for something to put on the table, and she always feared he wouldn't return. "Be careful, my child," she said, gently caressing his cheek before returning to her apartment, leaving the door slightly ajar to listen for any signs of trouble. The city, with its relentless whirlwind, seemed indifferent to the drama unfolding on its edges. As night fell and the lights of the buildings began to glow, Kevin's world and Matthew's seemed destined to never cross paths. But the wheel of fate turned without pause, weaving invisible connections that would soon test the convictions and hearts of everyone involved. With one last look at Lily, Matthew stood up and stepped out into the cold, carrying with him a desire that pushed him beyond mere need, the hope that, somewhere in the city, he would find the help he so desperately needed. The night had fully descended over the city, and the main avenues sparkled with a brightness that was almost blinding. The windows of restaurants and boutiques displayed opulence that clashed violently with the dark, damp alleys where shadows moved like ghostly figures. On one of the busiest corners of the exclusive area, a building gleamed like a jewel under the spotlights. Kevin Miller's flagship restaurant, a symbol of luxury and success that attracted the city's rich and famous. Matthew walked with his jaw clenched and eyes fixed on the building. Beside him, Lily, wrapped in a tattered blanket, struggled to keep her balance with her trembling steps. The girl's labored breathing pierced Matthew's heart, who pressed his lips together to hold back tears. Upon reaching the imposing entrance, the contrast between the siblings and the restaurant's patrons was as obvious as the difference between daylight and the dark of night. Matthew and Lily's clothes, worn and stained, clashed with the silk suits and dresses passing by them, accompanied by the soft scent of expensive perfumes and carefree laughter. The restaurant's glass doors opened, and Kevin Miller appeared, surrounded by partners and his inseparable assistant, Marcos. The group spoke in low voices, the tension palpable in the air. Kevin barely looked around as he moved forward, his attention focused on business problems and numbers he needed to adjust. Matthew, seizing an opportunity, stepped forward and raised his voice. "Please, sir," he said, his voice broken but firm. Lily, by his side, looked at him with pleading eyes, her face flushed with fever and exhaustion. Kevin turned his head slightly, his gaze passing over the children as if they were part of the urban landscape. Without stopping or slowing down, the group walked away, leaving behind an echo of conversation and a trail of perfume. Matthew felt the weight of disappointment pressing on his chest, and his hands shook as he clutched the blanket covering Lily. However, his eyes remained fixed on Kevin until he disappeared into the night. From a kitchen window, May, the restaurant's chef, watched the scene with a lump in her throat. Her brown hair, tied up in a tight bun, moved slightly with the steam and heat from the kitchen, but her gaze was locked on the two children at the entrance. May knew what it was like to be in their place. The memory of cold, empty nights from her own childhood still lingered in her mind. With a quick glance around to ensure no one was watching, she grabbed a piece of freshly baked bread and silently crossed the kitchen. She went out through the back door and in one swift motion threw the bread to Matthew. Their eyes met for an instant. In Matthew's, a flash of surprise and gratitude, and in May's, a deep, shared pain. Without saying a word, May returned to the kitchen and closed the door behind her, breathing heavily, hoping her gesture wouldn't get her into trouble. Matthew caught the bread with trembling hands and immediately shared it with Lily, who bit into it with a faint smile. As she chewed, a spark of hope ignited in Matthew's heart, momentarily replacing the frustration and sadness that had accompanied him all day. He silently promised that one day he would do more than ask for help. He would be the one to help others. At the restaurant, Kevin, unaware of the small interaction that had just taken place near his empire, continued his conversation, blind to the seed of change that had begun to sprout right at the doorstep of his success. But the wheel of fate, in its relentless spin, had already started to carve a path that would intertwine the lives of all of them in ways none could predict. The community shelter, a building of worn bricks and windows trembling in the wind, was a sanctuary amid chaos. Its walls, covered with old posters and children's drawings, vibrated with the echoes of laughter and murmurs, a sound that contrasted with the daily hardships faced by its residents. Although the paint was peeling and the ceiling had moisture stains, for many children and families, the shelter was the only place they could call home. May, the chef from Kevin's restaurant, moved through the shelter's halls with a mix of determination and tenderness. Every week, after her exhausting shifts in the kitchen, she would sneak in with bags of leftover food and basic supplies. She couldn't let the children go hungry, not when she had experienced empty nights in her own childhood. Her rough hands, calloused by work, distributed the food swiftly, but her eyes always sought out two particular figures, Matthew and Lily. Thomas, the grey-haired teacher with a deep voice, watched May with a smile that lit up his face despite the wrinkles and fatigue. He was the mentor for most of the shelter's children, a man who had exchanged comfortable classrooms for the cold, underfunded halls of this community space. His passion for teaching, however, was as alive as it had been when he was young. In Matthew, Thomas had discovered an intelligence and curiosity that surpassed the circumstances. Every night, when the noise of the shelter quieted and only the buzz of a solitary light bulb remained, Thomas would spread out crumpled papers and scrawl formulas and diagrams that Matthew eagerly absorbed. "Today we will learn something new, Matthew," said Thomas, his voice rough but upbeat, as he pointed to a simple diagram of the lungs. Matthew listened intently, his eyes shining with a mix of fascination and urgency, driven by the desire to save Lily. In the shelter, tensions were constant as well. Rick, a street child who had earned a corner of the place for himself, moved with a defiant attitude, his biting words provoking friction. He distrusted everyone, especially adults, and his resentment toward the rich and powerful was palpable. The other children avoided him or laughed awkwardly when he made sarcastic comments, but Matthew saw something else in him, a sadness they both shared, even if he never mentioned it. One day, Charlotte, the nurse with a kind smile and tireless energy, arrived at the shelter after her shift at the hospital. She had started volunteering to ease Thomas's burden and offer basic care to the children. When she saw Lily, fragile and with a persistent fever, her eyes filled with concern. The little girl, with her weak but hopeful smile, reminded her of stories from her own childhood, of nights when fear and illness seemed insurmountable. Charlotte took care of Lily, offering advice and home remedies that brought some relief. As Matthew watched Charlotte tending to his sister, a spark of gratitude lit up inside him. Knowing that someone else cared for them, especially Lily, was a balm that strengthened his resolve. However, the shelter's atmosphere wasn't just one of struggle and survival. The laughter of the children and the warmth of the community created moments where the difficulties were momentarily forgotten. May and Thomas organized small activities so the children could learn and play, and hope grew among them like green shoots in arid soil. Rick, always in a corner with his dark eyes watching every movement, remained vigilant, searching for something that could give him answers about his father's disappearance. His resentment toward the rich wasn't unfounded. He had grown up fed by stories of neglect and betrayal, of men like Kevin Miller, whose name was whispered among workers as a villain who brought nothing but broken promises. The shelter was, therefore, a space filled with stories and faces of hope and pain. Every person who passed through its doors left a mark, and each day became a new page in the shared history of struggle. As May sat for a moment, watching Matthew explain something to Lily that he had learned from Thomas, she knew that the connections forged in that place were stronger than any adversity could break. She had no idea that soon, the world of the powerful and the forgotten would intertwine in ways that would change their lives forever. The day began early at Kevin Miller's headquarters, a space full of elegance and coldness, where the marble floors and glass walls reflected the natural light of the city. Kevin sat in his office, his eyes fixed on a report detailing the progressive decline of his investments. Eduardo, his most cunning rival, had ceased being a mere nuisance and had become a tangible threat. Eduardo was known for his relentless nature and his ability to use questionable methods to gain ground in the market. Marcos, Kevin's assistant, entered unannounced, with a stack of documents and a demeanor that concealed calculating intentions. For years, he had served Kevin with apparent loyalty, but Eduardo's promises of a prominent position and a stake in a new restaurant chain had tempted him. Marcos moved with precision between his duties, hiding his betrayal under a mask of efficiency and obedience. "I need you to keep an eye on Eduardo's every move, Marcos. We can't afford any more surprises," Kevin said, his voice laden with tension as he flipped through the pages with palpable impatience. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the mahogany desk, marking the beat of his anxiety. "I'm on it, sir," replied Marcos in a neutral tone, avoiding eye contact. His mind was already on the next steps he needed to take to ensure his hidden loyalty to Eduardo. Within the same company, Anna, the head of human resources and Kevin's friend from their university days, had begun to notice some inconsistencies. Documents that disappeared and reappeared in different places, unanswered emails, and last-minute changes to meetings piqued her observant instinct. Anna knew Kevin better than most and had been there for him during his most vulnerable moments, even when he shut himself off from the world. Her loyalty to her friend pushed her to investigate, but she knew that if she was wrong, her own job would be at risk. Meanwhile, Eduardo moved his pieces with the precision of a chess player. He used Marcos as an informant, leaking confidential data that gave him the advantage in a game where there was room for only one winner. His calculating gaze focused on the moment to strike where it would hurt the most. Kevin's reputation and his trust in his team. Far from the office tensions at the shelter, Matthew continued his studies with Thomas. Every afternoon, the sounds of the city blended with the deep voice of the teacher explaining formulas and concepts that Matthew eagerly absorbed. But even in this oasis of learning, news of Kevin's company's decline began to reach everyone's ears. It was said that Kevin's financial problems were getting worse, and that Eduardo, with his unscrupulous tactics, was winning the game. May, who overheard snippets of conversations from the restaurant customers, felt a knot in her stomach. She knew that if Kevin's restaurant chain collapsed, the shelter would lose one of its most important indirect supports, as the leftover food May salvaged was a vital part of her work to help the children. The pressure in Kevin's life grew like a knot tightening around his neck. Eduardo's visits to the media, where he subtly suggested that Kevin's chain was on the brink of collapse, made investors waver. Kevin found himself more and more alone in his office, surrounded by echoes of conversations about money, power, and betrayal. Alone in his office, with the afternoon light faintly filtering through the glass, Kevin stared at a photo of his mother in the corner of his desk. His thoughts turned to his childhood days, to the lessons of empathy and compassion she had taught him, things he had left behind on his way to the top. After reviewing documents and analyzing patterns, Anna finally confronted Marcos. The conversation was brief and filled with tension. "I know something isn't right, Marcos. And if you're playing with fire, you'd better confess now," she warned him, in a voice that left no doubt about her determination. Marcos, however, smiled with the calmness of someone who had a well-orchestrated plan and simply replied, "Be careful, Anna. Not all secrets deserve to be revealed." Anna left Marcos's office with a mix of fear and certainty. She knew that what she had uncovered could trigger a storm, but she was also aware that protecting Kevin was now a race against time. While Kevin continued his battle at the height of power, the foundations of his world began to tremble. Betrayal, ambition, and the thirst for control were the pieces in a game he hadn't seen coming, and on this board, every move defined who would emerge victorious and who would be dragged into the abyss. The news about the fragility of Kevin Miller's restaurant chain spread like an underground river, seeping into conversations in the offices and investor meetings. Eduardo, Kevin's relentless rival, seized every opportunity to stir the rumors, enjoying the collapse of his adversary. Kevin, for his part, felt the constant pressure tightening his chest like an invisible chain, forcing him to seek strategies he would have previously dismissed as acts of weakness. For the first time in years, Kevin was forced to step out of his sphere of luxury and power to face public perception. Marcos, his assistant, was the one who suggested, with a smile that hid his true intentions, an idea that could save his reputation. Visit the poorest neighborhoods and present a philanthropic gesture. Kevin agreed, not out of conviction, but out of the need to regain the control Eduardo was gradually taking away from him. The day of his first visit, the city seemed to wrap itself in a cloak of uncertainty. Kevin arrived in a black car that stood out like an intruder amidst the uneven, cracked streets. The children, accustomed to noisy, worn-out cars, moved aside as they saw him get out, with his shining shoes and expensive coat. The adults watched with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. The gestures of the rich rarely meant anything good. As Kevin walked through the narrow alleys, the smells and sounds brought back memories he had buried under years of success. He passed a corner where a group of children played with a rag ball. Their laughter echoed in the cold air. One of the children stopped and looked at him directly, with big, expectant eyes. Kevin turned away, feeling a pang that surprised him, making his jaw tighten. From one of the old, faded houses, May watched the scene with a furrowed brow. She didn't understand what Kevin Miller, the owner of the restaurant that demanded perfection and long hours from her, was doing walking these streets. Her instincts told her it was nothing more than a move to calm the rumors. But when her eyes fell on the children watching him from the corners, her mind remembered her own childhood, when the visit of a stranger could mean a night with food or a day without hunger. Unknowingly, Kevin was approaching the shelter. Thomas, the old teacher, was outside, organizing some papers and giving instructions to the children. When their eyes met, the air seemed to thicken. Thomas recognized him immediately, not as the successful businessman seen on magazine covers, but as the boy his mother used to take by the hand through these very neighborhoods, handing out food and blankets. However, that version of Kevin seemed to have disappeared long ago. The murmurs and critical stares quieted a little when Kevin approached the shelter and looked at the worn sign hanging above the door. The words Centro Comunitario Hope danced in the wind, held by frayed ropes. Kevin took a deep breath and for a moment hesitated, but just then the door opened and Matthew appeared, holding a textbook. Their eyes met, and Kevin felt that familiar pang, stronger this time, as if something in his chest broke a little. Matthew, who didn't immediately recognize the man in front of him, sensed a strange mix of power and sadness in his gaze. The young boy stepped aside without saying a word, letting Kevin enter the place that meant so much to him and Lily. The narrow hallways of the shelter, decorated with drawings and small projects made by the children, seemed to absorb the echo of Kevin's footsteps, reminding him of a past he preferred to ignore. Thomas, with the calm of a man who had seen too much, greeted him with a look that spoke of both respect and distrust. "Welcome to the shelter, Mr. Miller," he said firmly, and Kevin nodded without a word. Everything he had planned to say dissolved in his throat when he saw the children staring at him with curiosity and suspicion. As the afternoon went on, Kevin walked through the shelter in silence, seeing Charlotte tending to a coughing child in a corner, May handing out bread she had brought from the restaurant, and Thomas explaining a lesson to the younger ones. Each scene weighed on his chest, a burden that was not guilt, but something deeper, something that pushed him to recognize that life was measured in more than financial success. As Kevin left the shelter, he stopped in front of the door and looked back. The faces of the children, especially Matthew's, followed him like persistent shadows. When he got in the car and the door closed, the city was left behind, but the emotions he had felt during the visit didn't fade. For the first time in a long time, Kevin Miller, the relentless businessman, felt the crack in his facade and wondered if it was too late to fix it. The day dawned with a cloudy sky, as if the city itself reflected Kevin Miller's state of mind. In the central office, the employees worked in silence, sensing the tension in the air. Kevin had spent the night reviewing reports and missed calls, uneasily noticing that Eduardo, his competitor, wasn't just gaining ground. He was doing it in a more calculated way than Kevin had imagined. Every move seemed to anticipate his own, as if someone inside his close circle was sabotaging him. Marcos, his assistant, entered with a cup of coffee and a barely perceptible smile, hiding an internal satisfaction. He knew that every step he took brought Eduardo closer to his goal and brought him closer to the recognition he felt he deserved. For years, he had endured Kevin's cold orders and lack of appreciation. Now, the opportunity for a more prosperous future and an ascent to power was within his reach. "Mr. Miller, here are the reports for the last quarters. I've prepared a summary with the most critical figures," Marcos said, placing the folder on the mahogany desk. Kevin barely lifted his gaze, his haggard appearance and the pallor on his face evident. He nodded without replying and dove into the papers, looking for an escape, a sliver of hope amid the collapse that felt ever closer. He didn't notice how Marcos left with a look of satisfaction, leaving the shadow of his betrayal in the air. In the same company, Anna, head of human resources, and Kevin's friend since their university days, had been observing. The disappearance of key documents and inconsistencies in meetings and strategies had raised her suspicions. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Anna quietly began an investigation, reviewing emails and cross-checking information discreetly. Her fingers moved swiftly on the keyboard, looking for the pieces that would connect the puzzle of betrayal. Meanwhile, in the streets and at the shelter, life went on. Matthew, more involved in his studies and helping Lily, couldn't ignore the news circulating about the possible fall of Kevin Miller's empire. The rumors whispered among the neighbors and in the shelter, where May and Thomas debated the impact the closure of the restaurants could have on the community. May, despite her initial reluctance toward Kevin, couldn't help but feel concerned about what the situation might mean for the children she helped. On one of those days, while May was distributing food and Thomas was organizing a science lesson, Anna arrived at the shelter. She carried a bag with donated toys and books, but also an air of concern that May immediately noticed. "Is everything okay, Anna?" May asked as she arranged the food on a worn table. Anna sighed and looked around, observing the children playing, and Matthew, who was helping Lily with an open book in her hands. "No, May, everything is not okay. Kevin's company is in danger, and I think there's something darker happening. Marcos, there's something about him that doesn't sit right with me." May nodded slowly, not wanting to show surprise. She had noticed the changes in Marcos, the way his gestures and glances had seemed more calculated in recent weeks. But before she could respond, a shout at the entrance of the shelter caught both their attention. It was Rick, the sarcastic young boy who was always on the verge of an emotional outburst, arguing with one of the volunteers. "Don't tell me I can't come in because I will anyway." His voice was filled with rage, and his dark eyes challenged everyone. Charlotte, the nurse, moved closer to calm him down, but Rick ignored her, fixing his gaze on Anna and May. "Do you know what's going on out there? Kevin Miller and all his fortune mean nothing. Those rich people never change, and we're the ones who pay the price. My father, he worked on one of his projects and never came back. Do you think Kevin did anything about it? Nothing. And now everything's falling apart. And we still don't matter." The shelter fell silent. Rick's words echoed like a reverberation in every corner, full of truth and pain. Anna swallowed hard, aware that Rick's resentment had deep roots. Thomas, with his usual patience, moved closer and placed a hand on Rick's shoulder, who finally let his arms drop and turned his gaze away. "Rick, we've all faced loss and betrayal, but the solution isn't in the anger. The solution is in what we do with that anger," said Thomas, his voice soft but firm. Meanwhile, Kevin continued facing a storm in his offices. The calls from investors withdrawing their support were relentless, and the media criticism was multiplying. Marcos observed from his place, reporting every new twist to Eduardo, while Kevin remained immersed in the struggle to salvage what was left of his empire. The night that changed everything came unexpectedly. Anna, after weeks of gathering information, finally found the evidence she needed: leaked emails, handwritten notes, and recorded calls showing how Marcos was passing information to Eduardo. The discovery left her frozen. She knew that revealing this could save Kevin, but it also meant confronting Marcos and risking her own job, even her safety. With no time to lose, Anna decided to confront Marcos directly. She called him to an empty meeting room where the flickering ceiling light cast unsettling shadows. "Marcos, I know what you're doing," Anna said in a steady voice, even though her heart was pounding. Marcos looked at her, first with surprise, then with a cold smile. "And what are you going to do, Anna? Tell Kevin? He's already finished. This ship is sinking, and I'm making sure I'm in the lifeboat. Wouldn't you do the same?" Marcos's response sparked a flare of anger in Anna. "Kevin has given you more than you think. And even though I don't agree with everything he's done, he deserves to know the truth. If you think you're going to get away with everything without a fight, you're wrong." Before he could respond, the door suddenly burst open and Kevin entered, his face contorted and his eyes filled with fury and exhaustion. He had heard enough. The silence that followed was like a harbinger of a storm. Marcos tried to offer an excuse, but Kevin raised a hand and silenced him. "I gave you my trust, Marcos. I thought you were loyal, but I see that in this game, betrayal is always lurking," Kevin said, his voice deep and broken. Marcos was escorted out of the building under security surveillance, while Anna took a deep breath, still feeling the tremor in her hands. Kevin sat down, for the first time in a long while, without his mask of control, and looked at Anna with a silent gratitude in his eyes. At the shelter, news of Marcus's betrayal reached May and Thomas, who felt that the battle for Kevin's salvation and all it represented wasn't just a business matter, but a fight for values and redemption. The impact of Marcus's betrayal not only weakened Kevin, but it also awakened a new understanding in him. The life he had lived, the way he had treated those around him, had left cracks so deep that his world was collapsing from the inside. As dawn broke, Kevin knew that rebuilding his life and legacy would require more than business strategies. The shelter, the place that had witnessed so many tears and laughs, was filled with an air of anticipation. News of Marcus's betrayal and the fall of Kevin Miller's company spread through the alleys like wildfire. But for Matthew, the fight never stopped. Each day represented a new challenge and a new opportunity to move forward. He was no longer just the boy who took care of his sister in a dark corner. At 16, he had grown in stature and strength, and his intelligence had made him stand out as a natural leader among the children in the shelter and the youth in the community. Thomas, the teacher with the deep voice and measured gestures, watched with pride as Matthew took on new responsibilities. Now, in addition to helping Lily and passionately studying the lessons Thomas taught him, he organized activities for other children, teaching them what he had learned and sharing his dream of a better future. Matthew's talks weren't just lessons, they were motivational speeches that sparked a spark of hope in those who listened. "Remember, knowledge is the one thing they can never take from us," Matthew said, standing in front of a group of children of different ages, his voice firm and his eyes bright. His words were simple, but filled with conviction. The children looked at him with admiration, as if in his figure they found a reason to believe that anything was possible. The shelter had become a hub of community activity, a place where life's difficulties could be transformed into learning and solidarity. May continued bringing food and organizing cooking classes to teach young people practical skills, while Charlotte, the nurse, taught basic first aid. Matthew absorbed every piece of information, sharing it with Lily, who, despite her fragility, showed slow but steady improvement. One day, in the middle of a chaotic afternoon full of laughter and running, a man with grey hair and round glasses entered the shelter. He was a representative from the local university, drawn by rumors about the young man leading a small educational revolution in one of the city's most marginalized neighborhoods. He had heard Matthew's name in meetings and conferences where his exceptional intelligence and relentless determination were mentioned. Thomas, recognizing the visitor, felt his heart race. This was a unique opportunity. The representative observed Matthew, who was in the middle of a lesson, explaining how the body's systems worked. The precise gestures of his hands and the passion in his voice caught the visitor's attention. "That boy has a gift," the man murmured to Thomas, not taking his eyes off Matthew. Thomas smiled with contained pride. "More than a gift, he has a mission, and there's nothing more powerful than that." The arrival of that man marked the beginning of a significant change in Matthew's life. The university offered him a scholarship to continue his medical studies, a dream he had nurtured since the darkest nights when Lily's cough kept him awake. The news spread like wildfire in the shelter and in the neighborhood. The children cheered and surrounded him with joyful shouts, while May and Charlotte hugged each other emotionally, their eyes shining with tears of happiness. However, not everything was celebration. Rick, the sarcastic young man who had grown up on the streets and whose distrust of the rich and the system remained firm, watched from a corner. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes, filled with a mix of admiration and resentment, followed Matthew's every move. For him, the news of Matthew's scholarship was proof that some people could get ahead while others were left behind, trapped in the injustice that marked their lives. One afternoon, as Matthew helped Lily solve a math problem, Rick approached. "So what now, Matthew? Are you leaving? And are you going to leave us here, like everyone else who escapes from this hole?" Matthew looked at him, surprised by the hardness in Rick's voice. His eyes, which once reflected an indomitable spark, were now filled with pain that Matthew recognized all too well. In a calm voice, he responded, "I'm not leaving forever, Rick. What I learn, I'll bring back. If one of us moves forward, we all move forward." Rick let out a bitter laugh. That's what they all say. And then, when they get what they want, they disappear. Rick's words lingered with Matthew like a persistent echo. He understood his friend's skepticism. After all, life on the streets hardened the heart, and hope became a luxury. However, Matthew promised himself that, no matter what, he would not be one of those who forget where they come from. Meanwhile, in Kevin Miller's offices, the atmosphere was very different. After the revelation of Marcos's betrayal, Kevin had sunk into a state of reflection and exhaustion. The nights were long, filled with memories of his childhood and the voice of his mother speaking of compassion and empathy. Visits to the shelter and the faces of the children, especially Matthew's, began to appear in his dreams and awaken a consciousness he thought was long asleep. Eduardo, for his part, continued to exploit every weakness of Kevin's to consolidate his power. The news of Matthew's scholarship even reached his ears, and although he dismissed it as insignificant, Kevin listened with renewed interest. Seeing Matthew advance despite all the hardships reminded him of the days when he himself had struggled to get ahead, driven by his mother's faith and values. A spark of hope, though faint, began to ignite in Kevin's chest. Weeks passed, and Matthew prepared to start his university studies. The community gathered to send him off with a simple event where the children sang and displayed handmade posters with messages of encouragement. May and Charlotte looked at him with maternal pride, while Thomas, with shining eyes, whispered in his ear, "This is just the beginning, Matthew. Never forget where you come from or where you're going." Matthew's embrace with Lily was long and filled with silent promises. She, now stronger and with a smile on her lips, said, "I'll wait for you, brother. I know you'll come back and take care of us all." Rick, from his usual corner, watched the scene, his emotions divided between envy and hope. Something in Matthew's speech and the way the community gathered around him made him reconsider his own beliefs. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way for him to find a different path. The day Matthew left the shelter to begin his journey at the university, the city seemed to shine a little brighter, as if the story of a young man who had risen from nothing were a sign that sometimes destiny could change. The night had been long and heavy, and the first light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the windows of Kevin Miller's office. Documents were scattered across the desk, each page a reminder of the disintegration of his empire. Marcos's betrayal had triggered a chain of events that pushed him to the edge of the abyss. Investors had withdrawn their support, and Eduardo, his most ruthless competitor, continued to seize every opportunity to advance in his business conquest. The lines on Kevin's face were deeper than ever, and the dark circles under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights and unrest. Kevin was no longer the same man who had first entered that office with dreams of conquest. He felt worn out, not just by the financial loss, but by the growing sense of emptiness that consumed him. Since the visits to the shelter and the meeting with Matthew, something inside him had started to awaken. The memories of his mother, of the lessons about empathy and generosity, were now ghosts that followed him into every corner. But reality left no room for introspection. The company was collapsing, and he had to act. The phone rang, breaking the uncomfortable silence in the room. Kevin stared at it for a moment before answering, his voice harsh and exhausted. "What's happening now?" "Mr. Miller, the press is publishing new leaks about the drop in stock prices. Eduardo gave an interview where he hints that your company won't survive this quarter." Anna, the head of human resources, responded, her tone concerned. She had been working tirelessly to keep morale high, but even she felt how the pressure was pulling them down. Kevin closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to push away the headache pounding in his skull. "Thanks, Anna. Do what you can to control the damage. I'll speak with the investors later." But before he could hang up, Anna added, "Kevin, I think you need to rest. You've gone weeks without a full night's sleep, and this is starting to take a physical toll. If you keep going like this, I don't know how much longer you'll be able to hold on." Kevin didn't respond immediately. Anna's words resonated with a truth he couldn't ignore, but admitting it felt like defeat. However, a sudden dizziness made him grab the edge of the desk, and for a moment, the room tilted before him like a ship about to capsize. That afternoon, while trying to regain control in a crucial meeting with his main advisors and partners, Kevin felt his body finally give way under the accumulated pressure. The concerned faces of the attendees distorted in his blurred vision, and before he could say a word, a cold sweat ran down his back. Then, everything went black. The sound of his body collapsing onto the carpet echoed in the room, freezing everyone for an eternal second. Marcos, despite his past betrayal, instinctively moved toward Kevin, but Anna shoved him aside with a piercing glance. "Call an ambulance!" she shouted, breaking the silence that had paralyzed everyone. The news of Kevin Miller's collapse spread quickly. Online headlines were updated. Magnate Kevin Miller hospitalized after collapse amid business crisis. Social media was ablaze with speculation, some filled with morbid curiosity, and others with unexpected compassion. Hours later, Kevin was admitted to a public hospital, the only one nearby amidst the city's dense traffic. It was a place he had ignored in his rising years, but now it embraced him with its worn walls and the echo of hurried footsteps. The irony didn't go unnoticed by those who recognized him as he was wheeled in, pale and gasping for breath. Matthew, who was already well known in the hospital for his dedication and empathy, was in the middle of his shift when the news reached him. At first, he only heard other residents mention a name that made him stop in his tracks. "Kevin Miller, the businessman? He's in the emergency room," they murmured, unaware that those words resonated with Matthew like an echo from the past. As he approached the room, he saw the bustle of the staff, the urgent orders, and the machines beeping incessantly. Kevin lay in a bed, unconscious, while the doctors stabilized him. Matthew froze for a moment, his mind drifting back to that night at the restaurant's entrance, Kevin's indifference, and then to the visits to the shelter. But the professional ethics that Thomas and Charlotte had instilled in him snapped him out of his trance. He moved among the other doctors and assumed the role that had been assigned to him. "We need to monitor his vital signs and ensure there are no neurological complications," Matthew said, keeping his voice steady as his hands worked with precision. No one in the room knew the connection between the young doctor and the patient in the bed, and Matthew preferred it that way. The hours passed slowly. Kevin gradually regained consciousness, his gaze wandering the white ceiling and the fluorescent lights. A sharp pain pierced his head, and the sound of the machines was unbearably loud. When his eyes focused, he saw a familiar figure by his side. Matthew, who was watching him with an expression that was neither compassion nor resentment, but professional neutrality. "Kevin Miller, I'm the doctor in charge of your case," Matthew said, hiding the emotion that threatened to break through his facade. Kevin looked at him, blinking several times as he tried to remember where he had seen those eyes before. But his mind was clouded, and the fatigue made him close his eyes again. The days that followed his hospitalization were a mixture of physical and emotional pain for Kevin. Between the visits of doctors and nurses, he watched Matthew move with efficiency and dedication. He recognized something in him, an inner strength that reminded him of his own years of struggle, before power and wealth had changed him. Each time Matthew approached, Kevin felt a pang of shame and guilt, but also something he hadn't felt in years: admiration. One afternoon, Kevin overheard a talk at the hospital, organized by the staff to inspire young volunteers and patients. Matthew, invited to speak, stood up in front of the audience and began telling his story. He spoke of adversity, of how he and Lily had fought on the streets, and how small acts of kindness had kept them afloat. When he mentioned their encounter in front of the restaurant and the impact it had had on his life, Kevin felt the weight on his chest grow until it became unbearable. The image of Matthew and Lily at the door of his restaurant, their pleading looks and his indifference, struck him with such force that he turned his face, unable to look at the young man as he spoke. The tears he had held back for so long came flooding out, and shame washed over him like a tide. Matthew, who noticed Kevin's reaction from the stage, paused for a moment. The silence in the room was absolute. He decided to continue, his voice softer but no less firm. What I've learned is that empathy and the support of others can change lives. Sometimes, all it takes is for someone to look beyond the surface to make a difference. That night, Kevin stayed awake, staring at the ceiling while Matthew's words echoed in his mind. Guilt was no longer just a shadow. It was a constant presence, pushing him to accept his mistakes and seek a way to redeem himself. But how could a man who had built his life by ignoring the needs of others change everything suddenly? That was the question that tormented him as the hospital, with its relentless rhythm of life and death, carried on. From that moment, Kevin knew that his path back wasn't just about recovering his company, but something much more important, recovering his humanity. And though he didn't know if it was possible, he was determined to try, driven by the story of a young man who, unknowingly, had reminded him of what it really meant to live. The hospital felt like a microcosm, where time moved slowly, every second marked by the monotonous beeping of machines and the hurried steps of nurses. Kevin Miller remained in his room, sitting on the bed, his gaze lost in the white walls. Matthew's words from the talk still resonated in his mind, pulling up thoughts he thought were buried long ago. Shame and guilt were his constant companions, a weight that made every breath feel like a struggle. However, the atmosphere in the room wasn't only filled with Kevin's regret. News of his hospitalization had awakened emotions in unexpected places. Rick, the young man who had grown up with sarcasm and distrust, heard about Kevin's arrival at the hospital while he wandered the halls. His dark eyes, filled with a pain he had learned to mask with disdain, lit up with a mixture of anger and resolve. For years, he had kept the story of his father, a man who had worked on one of Kevin's first construction projects and never came home. The shadow of that loss had shaped his life, turning him into the defiant and distrustful young man he was. Rick couldn't let this opportunity slip by. He moved through the halls, his mind running faster than his steps. He didn't need a detailed plan, he just wanted answers. The curious looks of the nurses followed him as he approached Kevin's room, but no one dared to stop him. When he reached the door, he saw Kevin sitting, his head down, shoulders hunched, with the expression of a man who had been stripped of all his masks. "Kevin Miller?" Rick's voice broke the silence like an unexpected blow. Kevin looked up, surprised by the interruption. His eyes took a moment to focus on the young figure standing in the doorway, chest heaving and hands clenched into fists. He vaguely recognized him from the visits to the shelter, but couldn't recall his name. However, the anger in Rick's eyes was unmistakable. "Who are you?" Kevin asked, his voice weaker than he intended. Rick stepped forward, crossing the threshold and slamming the door behind him with a sound that resonated in the room. "I'm the son of one of the men who worked for you on your first construction project, the one who never came home." His voice was low but full of rage that had been building up for years. Kevin's heart raced. The mention of a construction project brought vague memories, blurry faces of workers, hastily signed contracts, and details he had delegated without thinking twice. But the weight of Rick's words hit him with the force of a late revelation. "I don't know what you're talking about," he tried to say, but guilt stopped him from continuing. "Don't tell me you don't know," Rick shouted, stepping closer until he was only a few feet away from Kevin. "My father worked on the foundations, in the cold early mornings, where you were never around. He fell, there was an accident, and we never saw him again. No one from your company gave us answers. Just silence." Kevin felt the world closing in around him. He remembered the brief reports that had once made it to his desk, losses labeled as workplace accidents, signed without reading the details, and the promise that everything was under control. His mother's voice echoed in his head, reminding him of the lessons of empathy he had ignored. The faces of the children at the shelter intertwined in his mind with Rick's, and for a moment, Kevin couldn't hold back the tears. "There are no excuses I can give you," he finally said, his voice broken. "I was negligent. I don't know what else to say." The fury in Rick's eyes wavered for a moment as he heard those words. He hadn't expected a confession. He wanted a fight, a confrontation that would let him release years of frustration. But instead, he found a man broken, aware of his flaws and defenseless. That vulnerability threw him off balance. Do you know what it's like to grow up without answers? To see your mother cry every night and hear empty promises of help? To know that you'll never see the person who should be there for you again? Rick's words were a mix of pain and accusation, each one hitting Kevin like a hammer. Kevin looked Rick in the eyes, recognizing in them the same pain he had seen in Matthew, the same pain he had ignored in so many others. "I don't know. I didn't know until now," he admitted, letting his hands fall onto the bed. "And it's too late to ask for forgiveness, I know. But if I can do something to make it right, I will." The silence filled the room. Rick, who had imagined this moment so many times, didn't know how to respond. He had expected Kevin to defend himself, to deny everything, but the sincerity in Kevin's voice disarmed his anger. It wasn't about forgiveness, not yet. It was about finding a way to deal with the weight of his history. The door suddenly opened, and Matthew entered, alerted by the commotion. His eyes shifted from Rick to Kevin, and back to Rick, and he immediately understood the tension in the air. "Rick, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Rick took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "Looking for answers, and it seems I already have them." He turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall until the sound faded away. Matthew approached Kevin, who was still sitting, trembling from the confrontation. His eyes, once hard and calculating, now showed an emptiness that Matthew recognized, the weight of facing the consequences of his actions. "Matthew," Kevin tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. There was no excuse he could give, no gesture that could erase what had been done. The only thing he could do was face the truth and start building something new, even though the ruins of his past surrounded him. "It all starts with admitting it, Kevin," Matthew said, his voice calm and his gaze a mixture of compassion and firmness. "If you really want to change, it's not enough with words, it's the actions that matter." Kevin nodded, his eyes shining with a mixture of hope and fear. Because for the first time in years, he understood that his path to redemption wasn't in business deals or superficial donations, but in facing those he had ignored and, as much as possible, repairing the lives he had affected. The conversation with Rick was just the beginning. In the following days, Kevin began to receive visits from other familiar faces from the shelter. Children who were now young adults, with similar stories of lost parents in projects or broken promises. And with each encounter, each story, the armor that had protected him for so long began to erode. Matthew's gaze was always near, watching, assessing whether the man he cared for was capable of facing his mistakes and turning them into more than regret. The hospital, with its hallways full of life and death, became the setting where truths were faced and the possibilities of redemption began to take shape. Kevin knew that there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to walk each step, not as a cornered businessman, but as a man seeking to rediscover what it meant to be human. The soft light of dawn filtered through the hospital windows, casting long shadows in the room where Kevin Miller reflected in silence. The days following his confrontation with Rick had passed like a whirlwind, each conversation and every glance full of reproach, eroding the armor that had held firm for so long. The air in the room was heavy, filled with broken promises and lost opportunities, but also with a glimmer of something new, the possibility of redemption. Matthew came and went, attentive to the patient's needs, and while he maintained a professional distance, Kevin felt the presence of the young doctor as a constant reminder of the humanity he had left behind in his rise to the top. During the nights when the hospital fell into a silence broken only by the hum of machines and the occasional whisper, Kevin would reflect on Matthew's words and those of others who had confronted him. Actions are what matter. One afternoon, while Kevin looked out the window, he saw a group of children playing in the park across the street. The laughter, the shouts, and the carefree joy of the children awakened a distant memory in him, one where his mother, with her warm hands and broad smile, explained the importance of helping others. Life isn't measured by what you have, but by what you give, Kevin, she used to say, and those words, buried under years of ambition, now took on a meaning that both hurt and healed at the same time. Kevin knew it was time to do more than lament. The next day, he asked to speak with May and Thomas, two key figures in the shelter and in Matthew's life. The news of his request reached the shelter quickly, and the reaction was mixed. Some, like May, still held hope that true change was possible. Others, like Rick, couldn't believe that the man who had caused so much harm could transform. May and Thomas arrived at the hospital in the afternoon, just as the sunlight began to tint the sky with orange hues. Kevin, still pale and showing signs of exhaustion, welcomed them into his room. The three of them stared at each other in a silence filled with history and expectation. Kevin took a deep breath and broke the silence, his voice lower and more vulnerable than they expected. I know my words can't erase what I've done. I know I've been negligent, and my lack of empathy has caused more damage than I can repair. But I want to change that, and I want to start with the place where it all began for me. Thomas, ever the observer, tilted his head and looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. And how do you plan to do that, Kevin? Promises are easy. What matters is what comes after. Kevin nodded, aware of the truth in those words. I want to fund the shelter, not just as a one-time donation, but to transform it into a center that can offer education, health, and real opportunities for the youth. I want it to be a place where children like Matthew and Lily find support, not just for one day, but continuously. May felt a lump form in her throat. She remembered the nights when, after her shift at the restaurant, she would bring bread to the shelter and see Matthew taking care of his sister, his eyes full of determination and hope. The idea that Kevin could contribute to this cause sparked a glimmer of hope, though her skepticism lingered. It's a great project, Kevin. But it's not just about money, May said, her voice firm. Money helps, of course, but what really makes a difference is dedication, the willingness to be present and understand the people you've ignored for so long. Kevin looked at them, and for a moment, his eyes reflected a glimmer of emotion. I'll be there. I don't just want to donate. I want to be part of this, to learn from you and from the children. I want to understand their stories and be useful, not as the Kevin you knew, but as someone willing to build something new. Kevin's commitment didn't go unnoticed. In the following days, he coordinated a meeting with Anna and other community members who could help organize the project. While distrust was still palpable, Kevin's first actions began to dispel some doubts. The properties and resources of the company he still controlled were redirected to fund the shelter. Medical equipment, books, and food started to arrive, and the transformation of the shelter began. Matthew, observing it all from the perspective of a young doctor and emerging leader, felt a mixture of pride and caution. He remembered Thomas's words and the importance of actions over promises. One afternoon, he approached Kevin while he was overseeing the arrival of new supplies. You're taking the first step, but there's still much to be done, Matthew said, his voice calm but full of meaning. Kevin looked at him and nodded. I know, Matthew, and I know that forgiveness isn't earned in a day or a month, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to deserve it. The transformation of the shelter moved quickly. The faded walls were repainted, the makeshift classrooms turned into well-equipped learning spaces, and a small clinic began to take shape thanks to the collaboration of Charlotte and other volunteer doctors. The laughter and chatter of children filled the air, and the place that had once been a modest shelter became a center of hope for the community. Rick, who had watched the metamorphosis from afar, approached one day, driven by a mixture of curiosity and the need for answers. He found Kevin in the courtyard, helping the children plant a community garden, an image that seemed almost surreal to him. The young man couldn't help but approach, his steps slow and his gaze full of unanswered questions. "Why now?" Rick asked, his voice harsh and his eyes narrowed. Kevin turned toward him, putting down the tools. "Because I've learned that everything I built before was empty if it didn't include the people who truly matter. Because I'm tired of being someone who lives only for himself." Rick watched him in silence, evaluating every word. It wasn't immediate forgiveness, but it was a beginning. As the weeks passed, Kevin became more involved. He participated in the activities, listened to the stories of the children and the adults who, like Thomas, dedicated their lives to others. Although his presence initially caused discomfort, over time, his gestures and actions spoke louder than his words. The story of Kevin Miller, the man who had once been synonymous with cold and distant power, began to change in the perception of those he had ignored. The day of the official reopening of the renovated center arrived. The name of his mother, engraved on a bronze plaque at the entrance, reflected the rays of the morning sun, and Kevin couldn't help but feel a pang of emotion. Matthew and Lily were present, along with May, Charlotte, and Thomas. The children crowded around, laughing and playing, while the adults prepared for the speeches. When Kevin stood up to speak, the silence was total. He looked at the crowd, and his eyes met Matthew's and Rick's, both looking at him with different expressions but equally expectant. "Today, I'm not here as the man you once knew. I'm here as someone who has learned from his mistakes and who understands that the true wealth of life is not measured by what we own, but by what we share. This center is not just a renovated building. It's a symbol of what we can accomplish when we unite our forces and take care of one another." Kevin's words resonated in the air, and for the first time in a long while, he felt he had said something that truly mattered. Matthew, hearing him, felt that the promise of change he had hoped for was not just an illusion. He had seen Kevin face his ghosts and make decisions that proved that regret could turn into action. The ceremony ended with the children running around, filling the place with an energy that felt new and powerful. Kevin watched it all from the side, a lump in his throat. When Matthew approached and extended his hand, he understood that this gesture was more than just an action. It was a bridge towards something bigger than forgiveness, the possibility of redemption. That day, under the bright sun and the laughter of the children, Kevin Miller knew he was on the right path. The transformation he had started in the shelter was also the transformation of his own life, and although the journey had just begun, he was determined to walk it until the end. The dawn over the city arrived with a renewed air. The streets, though still filled with the daily struggles of its inhabitants, vibrated with a subtle optimism that stretched from the heart of the renovated shelter, now known as the Hope Community Center. The name not only honored the memory of Kevin Miller's mother, but also encapsulated the renewed purpose of the place, to be a beacon for all those who had once felt abandoned to their fate. The work had not been easy. The days of reconstruction were filled with challenges, from coordinating supplies to organizing volunteers. But Kevin, for the first time in years, had rolled up his sleeves and worked side by side with May, Thomas, and Matthew. The hands that once only signed contracts and sealed deals now carried bricks, painted walls, and fixed roofs. Every drop of sweat and every wound on his hands was a reminder of what was at stake. Not just the redemption of a man, but the promise of a better future for an entire community. The center had not only received an aesthetic makeover, the internal structure had also been transformed. A complete clinic, led by Charlotte and assisted by other young doctors, was ready to care for those in need. The center's classrooms now had whiteboards, shelves full of donated books, and computers that would allow children and young people to learn essential digital skills. Thomas, with his always serene stride, was already planning lessons covering everything from basic sciences to history and literature. News of the center's rebirth had spread throughout the city, and during the opening ceremony, the community gathered to be part of a historic moment. The nearby streets were adorned with ribbons and balloons, and the murmur of conversations mixed with the laughter of children and the sound of live music from afar. May had spent the early morning baking bread and sweets to offer during the celebration, while Charlotte and Matthew put the finishing touches on the clinic, making sure everything was in place for the big day. Kevin stood at the edge of the central courtyard, observing the activity with a smile that hadn't appeared on his face in years. He felt the warmth of the conversations around him, and for the first time, not as an intruder. Amid the crowd, Rick, always with his observant air, watched with a mixture of curiosity and reluctance. He had seen Kevin working, had noticed his commitment, but he still couldn't completely release the caution that kept him on guard. Matthew, moving among the attendees, greeting the children and talking to the adults, noticed Kevin's pensive expression and approached. "Today is an important day," he said, with a smile that reflected both pride and calm. Kevin nodded, grateful for the support of the young doctor who, unknowingly, had been the catalyst for his change. "Thank you, Matthew," said Kevin, his eyes meeting his. "Not just for today, but for everything. If it weren't for you, for what you represent, I don't think I would have ever seen what truly matters." Before Matthew could respond, Thomas stepped up to the small makeshift stage and cleared his throat. The crowd immediately fell silent, paying attention to the man who had been the pillar of the shelter for so many years. His voice, though filled with emotion, resonated clearly. "Today, we celebrate not just a renovated building, but a renewed commitment. This center has witnessed many stories, some full of pain and others of hope. But today, with everyone's effort, we are creating a new chapter, one where all of us, no matter where we come from, have the opportunity to dream and build a better future." The applause was a roar of approval, and the faces reflected a mixture of tears and smiles. When Thomas finished, May and Charlotte took the stage, presenting the new programs and thanking everyone who had made the transformation possible. Charlotte, with a warm smile, mentioned how the clinic would offer basic care and educational health talks, while May spoke of the cooking and nutrition workshops that would help families learn how to prepare healthy and affordable meals. Rick, who had stayed on the sidelines, felt a wave of emotions as he heard Charlotte mention the word family. He remembered the days when that word had meaning for him, before his father's disappearance shattered his world. When Kevin stepped onto the stage, the crowd fell silent again. Some, like Rick, watched with skepticism, others with curiosity. "Thank you for being here today," Kevin began, his voice trembling slightly before he found his firm tone. "Years ago, I thought wealth was the ultimate goal, the proof that I had achieved everything I needed. But I was wrong. True wealth is seeing a community come together, grow, and prosper. Today, this place bears the name of the woman who taught me that kindness and mutual support are the most valuable things. I promise to stay here, working alongside all of you, not as the businessman I once was, but as someone who finally understood what it means to be part of something bigger than himself." The silence that followed was deep, and when the applause came, it was sincere and warm. Even Rick, with his arms crossed and an unreadable expression, gave a slight nod, acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, people could change. The celebration continued with music, food, and laughter. The children ran from one place to another, some playing in the new community garden, and others exploring the classrooms filled with bright and unfamiliar materials. Kevin walked through the center, stopping to talk to the parents and thank the volunteers. Every conversation, every smile he received, was one more step on his path toward redemption. Matthew and Charlotte met in a corner of the clinic, watching as people came and went. Charlotte, her eyes full of admiration, took Matthew's hand. "You made this possible," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Matthew shook his head, smiling. "No, we all did. Each one of us, from Thomas and May to Rick and Kevin. This place is a reflection of what we can do when we don't just survive, but fight for something better." In a moment of calm, Rick approached Kevin, who was helping a girl plant a small flower in the garden. "Miller," he said, his tone serious, but not as harsh as usual. Kevin turned, surprised by Rick's presence, and placed the trowel on the ground. "Rick," he replied, waiting for what he was about to say. The young man looked at him for a moment, weighing his words. Finally, he spoke. "I haven't forgotten what happened. I can't forgive you yet, but I've seen what you've done. That means something." Kevin nodded slowly, recognizing that the road to reconciliation with Rick and others like him wouldn't be easy or immediate. But those words were a beginning, a sign that effort and sincerity could break barriers that time and negligence had erected. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in golden and purple hues, Kevin stood looking at the horizon, surrounded by laughter, music, and animated conversations. By his side, Matthew watched as well, and without saying a word, placed a hand on Kevin's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but one full of meaning. That day marked more than an inauguration. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in the lives of all involved. Kevin, who had once been a symbol of coldness and power, now represented the possibility of redemption. And the Hope Community Center was not just a physical place, but a symbol of what could be achieved when empathy and the will to change guided the way. The soft light of dawn enveloped the city, waking the streets with a warmth that seemed to reflect the renewed spirit of the neighborhood. The Hope Community Center had become a second home to many. The classrooms were filled with children who, with backpacks and contagious laughter, learned with a passion that had once seemed impossible. The clinic, led by Charlotte and her team, attended to patients needing everything from routine checkups to more specialized treatments. Kevin Miller, who had once been a symbol of detachment and power, was now a constant presence in those hallways, carrying boxes, helping the children, and participating in community activities. The months had passed quickly, and every day represented a new step toward a brighter future. The seeds that Kevin and the others had planted in that garden during the inauguration had bloomed, and now the center was surrounded by vibrant colors, as if nature itself were celebrating the transformation of the place and the people who inhabited it. Despite this, challenges had not disappeared. Managing the center required constant effort, and stories of struggle and overcoming continued to be part of daily life. Matthew, now a respected doctor, had found a balance between his work at the hospital and his dedication to the center. He spent his days in the consultation rooms, teaching the children and young people about health and self-care, inspiring them to follow in his footsteps. Lily, recovered and with a new sparkle in her eyes, attended nursing classes, determined to follow in her brother's footsteps and help others like her. Every time she saw Kevin interacting with the children, she noticed a genuine change in him, a commitment that went beyond guilt. It was love for what was being built. The center had become a refuge for many people, including those like Rick, who had begun to get involved in activities, initially with skepticism and little enthusiasm. Little by little, however, he found purpose in guiding the children and telling them stories of his own father, sharing lessons of resilience and overcoming. The hardness in his gaze began to soften, and although the scar of loss still marked his inner being, he had learned that helping others could also heal. One day, while the center buzzed with activity, Kevin met with Matthew and Thomas in one of the newly painted classrooms. They had been discussing how to expand the training programs to include technical courses and professional skills for the community's young adults. Kevin, with the firm voice and confident gestures that had once defined him in business, now spoke with a different passion, one that didn't come from the desire to win, but to help. "If we get more volunteers and specialists to come, We can open new doors for everyone who comes here. The idea is that no young person feels that the only option is the street, Kevin said, his gaze fixed on the expansion plans he had drawn out. Thomas, with a smile that reflected the satisfaction of seeing how the seeds he had planted in Matthew and others were finally bearing fruit, nodded. The change we were looking for wasn't just a better building, Kevin. It was this, a plan that allows the kids to dream and work for those dreams. Matthew, always observant, looked at Kevin and remembered the journey they had shared since their first encounter at the restaurant entrance. He was amazed to see how the man who had once represented everything he had despised had transformed into someone capable of understanding what it meant to sacrifice and fight for others. The community had also noticed the change. Kevin, who had once been seen with looks of distrust and contempt, now received greetings and thanks. Families offered him sincere smiles, and children ran to him to tell him about their little victories of the day. One afternoon, when Kevin was helping a girl adjust her backpack, he heard a voice that made him stop. "Miller, always working, huh?" It was Rick, approaching with a slight smile and his arms crossed. Kevin straightened up and nodded, returning the smile. "Someone has to do it, Rick." "Want to help me carry these boxes?" he said, pointing to a group of supplies that had just arrived. Rick shrugged and walked over. "Why not?" As they worked together, Kevin felt the barriers that had once separated their worlds starting to fade. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was a step towards something bigger. The night before the event, to recognize the center's progress, Kevin stayed late, overseeing the preparations. Matthew found him in the main hall, sitting on a bench and looking at the decorations, absorbed in his thoughts. "Shouldn't you be resting? Tomorrow is going to be a long day," Matthew said, breaking the silence. Kevin looked up and smiled, a gesture he had learned to make sincerely. "I couldn't leave without making sure everything was in order. I don't know why, but this matters to me more than anything I've done in my life." Matthew sat down beside him and looked around, memories of his childhood in that very space filling his mind. "Because you've learned that the value of what we do isn't in the applause or the numbers, but in the lives we touch. This place, these people, we've all changed thanks to what we've built together." Kevin nodded, and for a moment, the two of them sat in silence, sharing a deep understanding that didn't need words. The recognition event arrived on a sunny day with a fresh breeze. Families and volunteers gathered in the center's courtyard, where flowers and the colors of the children's games decorated the landscape. Charlotte and May moved among the attendees, making sure everything was ready, while Thomas and other teachers prepared the young people for their presentations. When Kevin's moment to speak arrived, he stood and walked to the stage. The crowd watched him, and in their eyes, Kevin saw something he never thought he'd see: respect. Kevin took a deep breath and began. "Today is not just a recognition of the work of a few, but of the strength of a community that, when united, can overcome anything. This center is proof that no matter how lost we may be, we can always find our way back. It took me a long time to realize that, and even longer to start walking that path. But thanks to all of you, I've learned that redemption is possible and it's worth fighting for." When he finished, the applause filled the courtyard, but what truly moved him was seeing Matthew and Lily approach and hug him, surrounded by the children and members of the community. It was a gesture that encapsulated everything he had gone through, everything he had learned, and everything he still had to do. Rick, from a corner, observed the scene, and though he didn't clap, his eyes showed a small spark of acceptance. May and Charlotte joined the crowd surrounding Kevin, laughing and sharing in the excitement of the moment. Thomas, with a calm smile, looked around, knowing that the future was in good hands. The sun began to set, bathing the center in a golden glow. The laughter of the children and the voices of the adults resonated in the air, while Kevin, Matthew, and the others stayed in the center of this small miracle, surrounded by hope, remembering that even the smallest gesture can change the world, and that true wealth is found in what we share and build together. Thus, in this space full of life, the past and present reconciled, and the future unfolded before them like a canvas ready to be painted with the colors of hope and redemption. The central lesson of this story is that redemption is possible when there is a genuine commitment to change and repair the damage done. Through sincere and consistent acts, even those who have erred in the past can rediscover their humanity and contribute positively to the lives of others. The story shows that actions speak louder than words, and that true wealth does not lie in what is accumulated, but in how it is shared and in the legacy we build based on empathy, forgiveness, and collaboration. Additionally, the story teaches that resilience and community support can transform lives, even in the most difficult contexts. When people unite, they can overcome adversity and create an environment where every individual has the opportunity to grow and reach their potential. And so we come to the end of our story, a story that has taught us that redemption, hope, and empathy are more powerful than we imagine. If you were inspired by the story of Kevin, Matthew, and the entire community at the Hope Center, remember that in real life, you too can be the change someone needs. Don't forget that even the smallest gesture can have a profound impact on someone else's life. If you liked this content, give it a like, subscribe for more stories that teach and inspire us, and don't forget to share this video with those you think need a reminder that true wealth is found in what we share and build together. Thank you for joining us, and until the next story that inspires us to be better.